Hello everybody, it's time to talk research methods. I know it's everybody's favorite topic. Let me see if I can supply some context that maybe makes it a tad more palatable. Perhaps not. I was a late bloomer. I didn't get to college until I was in my 30s, and I'd worked in an awful lot of places prior to that. Two metaphors that I think are important, or a metaphor and example. Research methods and knowing which research method to use becomes all important. I worked in construction for a couple of years, and I started as a construction laborer. And about the first tool that they told me that I needed, they said you better come with a hammer tomorrow, right? And you need a framing hammer, a 16-ounce framing hammer, 22-ounce framing hammer. It's got a waffle head. Beat it on the cement a little while so you don't cut yourself up when you miss hitting the nail, which you do. But notice, when it was time to hammer nails, the tool that I needed to use was the hammer, right? But then, about a week later, they said, well, you're going to have to trim these boards, so you're going to need a saw. And the whole point is that if you try to shorten a board with a hammer, you're going to have to work really hard, and it's probably not going to work out. So use a saw to cut the board. Use a hammer to drive the nail. And so it is with research. It's building a toolkit, and that's why we study research methods, and you have so much of this in your classes, is what is the correct tool for the job that I'm trying to do? So kind of keep that in there. Another aspect of research methods, for a while I worked in a paper mill. And the paper mill, we were undergoing what was called a total quality transformation. And the idea at the paper mill then was, instead of the boss making all the decisions and just barking orders at us workers, the idea was that we would start to understand our process. We would ask questions about our process, and then we would try to improve our process. So we would conduct experiments. I mean, we would run the paper machine with this one dial in this position, and then we would measure the outcome of what we think holding the dial in this position would affect, what property of the paper. And then we'd run it that way for a little while, and then the only thing that we would do differently after that is we would put the dial in this position. And then we would measure that same quality in the paper to see if moving the dial made a difference. Now that seems kind of pretty tame, but eventually what happened was we took greater and greater control over our process, and as bosses started to retire, they wouldn't replace them. Quality control inspectors retired, didn't replace them. It wasn't necessary because we were taking those responsibilities on ourselves, but we were using the scientific method. That is, we were using research methods to make our decisions. Opinion went out the door. I mean, opinion is a great starting place, but it's not, that's all it is a starting place. You have an opinion, now you test that opinion, that hypothesis, with empirical methods. So that's basically, this is usable in all aspects of life, not just in a social psychology class. So social research starts with a theory, and this is just a simple explanation of relationships or causes, right? So it's put in the dial. I think when we run the paper machine with the dial in this position, the paper is a little less stiff than when we move it here, and it loses some moisture running here, and the paper becomes stiffer. That's kind of a halfway between a theory and a hypothesis. But social research, right, is an attempt to scientifically develop support for our ideas. So what are the effects of racism on children in school? Might be a question that we would ask. Now, what's at stake in social research? Well, for many tenure-track professors, it's their career or not their career. Publications are all important to tenure-track academics, right? The publication count and the quality of the publications really determines whether they get tenure and whether they advance, whether they rise up the ladder or not. So it's big. It's a person's reputation and income that's at stake, right? But we need to be skeptical, because anytime that we have an idea, we say, I believe the world works this way, this is my hypothesis. The first thing we do as responsible researchers is say, but I could be wrong. That I have to be skeptical. Maybe it doesn't work this way, and how can I develop a test to demonstrate that it does work this way? How do I provide the evidence to support my hypothesis? So skepticism is key, and at this point then, what we get to is this idea of integrity, that we have to be on our honor. We can't make up data. We can't, eliminate data that we don't like. So at the heart of it is integrity. Now, this is Kurt Lewin again. You remember him. There's nothing so practical as a good theory, according to Lewin. And one of the reasons is because a theory has the capacity to generate myriad hypotheses, right? Now, hypothesis, how is it different than a theory? And I know this is an issue for a lot of students. The theory is broad, it's conceptual, and it's not actually testable because it's too broad. It talks in very conceptual, lofty terms. A hypothesis is a proposition that describes a relationship between two or more variables, but is very specific, and therefore it's testable. So it's more specific, it's amenable to scientific testing, and a single theory can literally generate hundreds of hypotheses, if you will. Now, there are some questions that empirical science just can't answer, and I think this represents kind of the boundaries of scientific knowledge, that scientific knowledge is amazing, but it does have its limitations, right? Scientific method is not appropriate for answering questions that can't be put to an empirical objective test, right? When we're talking about ethics, that's really the purview of philosophy. That's not the purview of psychology, right? We can't test what's ethical or demonstrate in the laboratory what's ethical or not. That's a position that we take. Right? Morality. Morality is often the purview of the church in many cultures that determines what is moral behavior and immoral behavior. There's no way to put that to an empirical test. Religious beliefs, which are correct, hey, which are not, can't be put to an empirical test. That's what religious leaders talk about. Now, I want to kind of twist around on this idea here. Let's suppose, and see if you agree with me or not, that most religions have a statement, a story, a narrative about what happens when you die. In fact, I think almost every religion has an explanation of what happens when you die. And this is important because we found in social psychology that people become very anxious when they think about death. They call it existential anxiety, and a whole area of social psychology has been built around terror management theory. That is, how do we manage dealing with the terror of our own death? And one thing that we might be able to test in terms of religion is to what extent does a religious belief, that is the narrative or the story that a religion tells about death, which is most effective in diminishing anxiety. And that's something we could do, because we could craft all these narratives, all these stories, we could expose participants, and we could measure their anxiety before and after hearing these stories and see which story diminishes their anxiety to the greatest extent. So we have to be careful, because it's not like psychology has nothing to say about religion or the effect of religion on people, but psychology should never put itself in the position of saying this religion is superior to that religion, right? That's not where we need to be. We can't say that you should prefer this and not prefer that. That's just not a realm where psychology needs to play. And I think it's important that psychology stay in its lane, right? And religion stay in its lane. They both serve purposes, right? So scientific psychology talks about the world in this way. Religion talks about the world in that way. Let's keep them separate. 5 steps to the scientific method. You guys have probably been exposed to this previously. I know high schools are becoming more and more effective in what they're teaching. What do? We develop a hypothesis. We perform a controlled test. We gather the objective data. We analyze the results, and finally we publish, criticize, and replicate the results. So let's talk about each in turn. So the hypothesis, it's a statement predicting the outcome. So it's very straightforward. That is, I expect the people in this experimental condition to do this, and I expect the people in the control condition to do that. And then I gather the data, and either my hypothesis is supported or it's unsupported. Note, we don't prove hypotheses. We develop evidence to support them or evidence to cast doubt upon them. Now, the operational definitions will be the basis of one of your assignments, so we'll get to this in a subsequent lecture. This is how the procedures that we're going to use to perform this test. precise procedures, and I'll give you some examples down the road. Now, the independent variable then is the variable manipulated by the experimenter. Let's go to medical research. The independent variable in medical research, if we're doing a drug test, is a placebo versus the actual experimental drug. Some people get the placebo, some people get the drug. That is the independent variable that's being manipulated. Notice the researcher changes that. You either get the placebo at the researcher's decision or you get the experimental drug. And how do we decide? Well, what we do is we randomly assign you. So we pick a number from a hat, whatever it is, and this person gets whatever chance suggests that they get. More on this in a little while, and you can back that up in your book as well. Now, data, information gathered by the researcher to test the hypothesis, and this is represented by a measure of a dependent variable, right? So we might test two different persuasive messages. Half of my participants hear message A, the other half hear message B, but what are we going to measure? We're going to measure then something that was supposed to be affected by reading either message, and the dependent variable then is the effectiveness of the message, let's say, in changing somebody's behavior. Now, analyzing the results, we generate data in terms of numbers. We do the statistical analysis. So all those statistical classes you've been taking, what the heck are they for? To help us learn to understand if there is a difference between these two numbers that represent the average of these two conditions, or is there not a difference, and to what extent is that difference significant? And then finally, what do? Well, and this becomes all important, is, for example, when Derek and I and Phil and Amanda wrote up our article on punishment and anger, what do? We sent it to a journal, and we said, hey, read our article, publish it, make us famous, make us rich, whatever. No, it's not quite that good, right? But what happens is then the journal editor, Paula Niedenthal, was the journal editor at the time. She looks at the article, she reads it, and she says, okay, this sounds pretty good. I'm going to send it to 3 people who are known to do work in this area, and we're going to have them review it. So that's the peer review, and their job is to pick the article apart, to find any potential flaws. And those will be communicated back to us, and we may be given an opportunity to try and address those objections by redoing the article or adding a study or whatever it is. But peer review is the basis of demonstrating agreement with the field of psychology at large to some extent, right? And then replication. Ideally what happens is someone looks at our study, then tweaks it, says, okay, if that's true, then this is probably true, and they attempt to replicate it in their laboratory. And so it goes. So we then find support for what we found by someone doing something similar but not identical. So that's just part 1, just a brief little smattering. And again, I really want you guys to be reading your books. Do not depend on these lecturettes entirely, because there's a lot more material that's in the book as well. So remember the sequence. Read, and then watch the videos, right? And then do the assignments and discussion boards. So let's call it good here, and I'll bring up part 2 here in a little bit. Bye.